well, I'm the Professor of the Study of Religions at UCC, and this is a new department which I'm heading up, the only one of its kind in Ireland, and it's devoted to the study of religions, particularly religions in the 19th to the 20th, 21st century. Well, it is an extraordinary story. This is an Irishman who was born in the south of Dublin, and he emigrated from Ireland, and he became very, very famous in Asia, right across from India to Japan, but he was forgotten to history. And a couple of years ago, he was discovered quite independently by someone called Alicia Turner, who's an expert on Burmese Buddhism, and she was researching in Burma. And Lawrence Cox at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, who discovered Dhammaloka through the English and the Irish sources. And I brought them together. And the three of us have been working intensively for more than a year now on the story of Damaloka, and it's just an extraordinary story. It seems very likely that he was born in Dublin around in the 1850s, that he left Dublin perhaps 1870 or so, went to Liverpool. From there he took ship to America. He probably sailed up and down on the East Coast, working on ships and so on, and then he was a hobo, and he traveled the railroads across America, right across to San Francisco, and then he worked on a paddle steamer transporting fruit down the Sacramento River. And in San Francisco, he got a job on the Pacific Mail lines, which used to go to Japan. And the story is, and of course all this depends on him, because this is the story he told, that he made 3 trips, and on the 3rd trip he was put off the ship because he was drunk, and he ended up, what they call on the beach in Yokohama. And so from Yokohama, from Japan, he made his way to Burma. He got a job in Burma as what's known as a tallyman, which is someone who just keeps a record of the cargo that's being unloaded from the ships. And this was in a place called Rangoon, which was the big harbour. And it seems as though he, at that time, he came in contact with the local Buddhists. And Buddhism in Burma, was a very, very impressive tradition. And he was obviously impressed by the Buddhists. And eventually he became a Buddhist, and he became a Buddhist monk. And that's the point at which, in a sense, our story begins, because we first encounter him from other sources as a Buddhist monk, but not until 1900. So there's almost 45, 50 years of his life that we really, at the moment, we don't know very much about. We only have his account. If you ask any scholar at the moment, any historian, any Buddhist studies expert, they will tell you that the first Western Buddhist monks were 2 British guys. One was called Alan Bennett, and the other one was called H. Gordon Douglas. And one of them was ordained as a monk in 1899, and the other in 1901, or 1900, 1901. And the point is that this is not true. And Damaloka was there before them. So he was certainly there before the people who are widely regarded, widely understood to be the first Buddhist monks. But in researching Dhammaloka, we've discovered that there were others who were Buddhist monks around the time. And of course, most of these fellows who became Buddhist monks went into a monastery and disappeared, and that's the last we hear of them. The point about Dhammaloka is that he became a public figure. He was very controversial, he was very well travelled, and he was a public speaker, and so we know all about him. But again, he's been forgotten in favour of these British guys, one of whom came to London, and his followers basically wrote the history of Western Buddhist monks, and that's why Dhammaloka's been written out of history. He didn't like Christianity, I think, for 2 reasons. One is he was, in any case, a free thinker, what they called a free thinker. He was an atheist, he was anti-clerical, and I think he'd have been like that even if he'd stayed in America. But in Burma, I think he saw what imperialism, the British culture, was doing to the Burmese, and I think this is why he went public. I think this is why he came out and he started to denounce, particularly Christian missions. Now, I think what he was doing in denouncing the Christian missions was, in a coded way, he was denouncing the whole imperial venture. And I think from that point of view, I mean, had he come out publicly and said, overthrow the British, then I think we'd have heard very little about him. He'd have been in jail. But because he confined himself to criticising Christian missionaries, particularly the new ones, the Protestants, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Anglicans, that meant that he was kind of safe, in what he did. As soon as he emerged in the public stage and started criticising Christian missionaries, the government tried to bring a case against him, although I think the missionaries probably tried to bring a case, but that failed. The Buddhists supported him and he was okay. Towards the end of his career, which we perhaps will come back to, he was tried for sedition precisely because he'd held a huge public meeting which thousands of people attended, and somebody made a complaint and he was brought to court, and so he was then prosecuted. I don't think he was imprisoned. I think he might have been put on remand for about a month while his appeal was being heard in 1910, 1911, and that incidentally was exactly 100 years ago. The anniversary of his first trial was in November 1910. It was a hearing in a magistrate's court. He appealed against it, and the big trial, which we're commemorating in early 2011, was the 31st of January 1911, exactly 100 years ago. His name was probably one of the following three: Lawrence Carroll, Lawrence O'Rourke, or William Colvin. Of course, it's only him we have as a source. There were no passports in those days, so they weren't introduced till 1915, and he could have been anybody, but those were the three names by which he was known. He was prosecuted under the name Colvin. He told a travelling writer that his name was Larry O'Rourke, and a number of people knew him as Lawrence Carroll. We can trace him up to 1914, by which time he was probably in his 60s, and that's a pretty good age for a European in Burma or Bangkok, which is probably where he was in 1914. Of course, in 1914, the First World War starts, all the attention, the press attention moves to the European theatre, and we haven't really got any records of him after 1914. And we don't have any record of his death. It's very probable that he was in a monastery, he died, he was cremated as a Buddhist monk, and that no record was kept of that. But we have sightings of him right up to the end of 1913 and indeed possibly 1914 in Bangkok, in Thailand. We're going to have a Dhammaloka Day. This is on Saturday, February the 19th. It's going to be at UCC, starting at 2:30 in the afternoon. It's open to everybody. We're going to have a panel of speakers, including a very well-known American Thomas Tweed, who's written all about American Buddhism in the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century. We're going to have Alicia Turner, Lawrence Cox, and myself, the researchers on the project. We're going to have Elizabeth Harris, who's written a lot about the fellow Alan Bennett, who went back to London and people thought until now was the first Western Buddhist. And we're going to celebrate, amongst other things, Dhammaloka's Irish connections, and indeed his Cork connections and his Munster connections, because he went to Japan, he went to India, he went to Ceylon, he went to Thailand, Nepal, Cambodia, Burma. He went all over East Asia, China as well. And in Japan he was helped by an Irish woman, Letitia Jeffson, who married one of the Jeffsons from Mallow. He was denounced in the press by the editor of the Singapore paper, and the editor of the Singapore paper was Edward Alexander Morphy of Killarney, and finally he was judged in that famous trial exactly 100 years ago by none other than Mr. Justice Daniel Harold Ryan Toomey of Carrick-Toohill, just outside Cork. So we want to talk about these connections and really try to put Dhammaloka back in Irish history where he belongs.